You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our regular listeners remember that on January 4th, our guest was Professor Joseph Jay, and we talked about his new book published by Shotwell Publishing, Sacred Conviction. We got about halfway through the book in our discussion of it, and so at the end of that program, we said that we would have Professor Jay back with us, and so that's what we're going to do today. So I called Professor Jay, and we finished talking about his book as well as some other things in the culture war and what's going on with the Southern Baptist Convention's hatred of the last couple of years of all things Southern. And we just talked about some of the different things that are going on in the culture war and how a lot of what was happening leading up to the war between the states is what's happening in the political and cultural climate even today. In other words, history is repeating itself. And so without giving too long of an introduction here, let's just go straight into our phone conversation. You talked in your book in chapter 4 about religious politics versus political religion.
Roughly speaking, in the North, they had no problem getting into political debates from the pulpit. You see this really as far back as the Revolutionary period, where, specific, this is kind of along the lines of the Black Robed Regiment. And I'm not saying I disagree necessarily with the Black Robed Regiment. At that time, they were more orthodox in their beliefs, but they had no trouble preaching sermons that were pretty much blatantly political. In the South, that just was not the case. They were, they would touch on political issues, but only insofar as they could see a chapter and verse behind it. It was already addressed in the Scripture. It wasn't something that they would go out of their way. I think today, you to an extent, you might see this in more, if you go to like a church that's more exegetical, where they're going through a book, they're not going to stray too far from that usually. And that was kind of the way the Southern preachers were. They're preaching the Bible, and that was their higher calling. And they just didn't get involved as much in the political debates, especially if they thought, there could be a Christian understanding of the debate in either direction. They weren't going to be the ones to come in and try to take a particular side of it. This probably helped their churches have a little more unity, but it came from a fundamental idea that there were spheres of authority, and the lane in which they ran from was the lane of religion, and it wasn't the lane of politics, and that God had given the church the responsibility to essentially be a minister of grace to people. Not a minister of justice. That was left to the government. The government's job was justice and not grace. And in the North, that wall kind of fell down. They did not. They started to see the church and the government as both ministering grace, and right. and so a line that was very much prevalent and cherished in the South was not existing in the North, and that, I think, was one of the key differences between them. Now, the reason this is relevant, I think, is because people will criticize Southern theologians. How come you didn't speak out against slavery more? You could have done more. And there's a lack of understanding in the theology. This happened just recently. Actually, there was a conference in which a very prominent Presbyterian, conservative Presbyterian, accused the folks that founded his own denomination, essentially. It's almost humorous when you think about it, but he said that they were in the wrong because they weren't loving their neighbor. They weren't fulfilling the second commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. And the reason was because they didn't oppose slavery enough. But if he actually understood from their perspective why they weren't more politically involved, then he wouldn't have made that statement. They were involved in slavery. They were very much so, but it was only insofar as the Word of God gave them the authority to preach on it. So they preached what the Word of God said. Slaves, submit to your masters. Masters, treat your slaves according to these regulations from Scripture. Treat them with kindness and Christian charity. And so they very much were preaching on the topic. It just wasn't the way that Northerners would have wanted them to preach on the topic, because anything other than free your slaves right this second, which of course had other implications that the Northerners wouldn't consider financial implications and even implications for the slaves. It wasn't good for all slaves to be freed right away. There had to be some kind of a preparation for this. That was the only thing that a lot of Northerners accepted as legitimate preaching on slavery, and that's just not true. And so I think that was one of the key differences. It came out in the slavery debate, but it touches other issues as well. They weren't into social reform like the Northern churches were. So, and you see that today to an extent a little bit. I think that still holds true in some ways. I think it's changing, but we're downstream from this thing now, and things are going to look different. But you still see those two worldviews in place.
As I look at religion in New England, and I'm not talking about antebellum religion, but you go back even well before the Revolution, you go, say, to the 1600s, through the 1700s, and I see a very strict, I see Puritanism as being almost the equivalent of modern-day fundamentalism.
Yeah, similar.
And to put it in the context that's totally separate from either of us. But the child of rebellious Pentecostal parents becomes a charismatic. Mm-hmm. And some of our audience, they won't even understand what I'm talking about, and that's fine.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah, but you get it. And even, you have the children of, I'll put this in context for you, okay? I was very upset about something. And somebody came to me one day, an older preacher came to me one day, and he told me, he said, you've done something right. He said, if your son's big act of rebellion is to start a Christian rock band, you raised him better than you think you did.
Yeah.
And so, I see Puritanism is kind of like the equivalent of what we would consider fundamentalism in our day. People who grow up in these strict fundamentalist homes and churches, they don't always abandon Christianity per se, but obviously in their rebellion, they go find, they grow up and they find a church somewhere that's the exact opposite of the one they grew up in.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's, extremely true, the example you gave. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of tons of people that fit that.
Yeah. And so do you think that the transcendentalism and the Unitarianism, rather than literally interpreting Scripture, but, basically just using the Scripture to, rending it to whatever you needed it to say at the time for whatever your, the different social causes, what have you, that were taking place in the North is the Northern churches. Do you think that the Northern churches were the way they were in the antebellum period because you had a generation, maybe a couple of successive generations, that had rebelled against the strict Puritanism of their grandparents?
I'm trying to understand what you're saying. Unitarianism was caused by rebellion against the more orthodox Puritanism? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm asking if religion by the antebellum period, if religion in the North was where it was,
right?
Because you had one or maybe successive generations that had rebelled against what I see as the more strict Puritanism of previous generations,
right? Or
is my interpretation of strict Puritanism just a misinterpretation, and Northern religion was always messed up, even from the beginning?
Yeah, messed up is like a broad term. So, it's possible that there were things that weren't so good in Puritanism. I mean, I kind of see it this way. I think Puritanism had the seeds to its own destruction kind of built within it to an extent. What you see in the comparison you just made, which I think is a perfect comparison between Puritanism and fundamentalism, is the attitude of Puritanism remained. And the comparison that a lot of Southern apologists make for Puritanism and modern, they'll say the Yankees who became the liberals of today, which I think is also a fair comparison, is the attitude remained. The theology necessarily did not. Fundamentalists obviously do not have the same theology that Puritans had. They're not Calvinists, at least not on paper. They tend to be more Arminian in their theology. They have but they do have that city on a hill kind of Americanism going on, and they do have this perfection, this perfectibility that we just got to keep these rules. If we keep these rules, we'll be good, and God will somehow bless us. And that's kind of, I think, the seeds that the Puritan had in their own theology that led to their demise. It was supposed to be focused on God. Man is completely depraved, cannot do anything apart from the grace of God, and it soon became man needs to do these things. Sanctification obviously is the evidence that God is working in your life. Edwards complains about this, that during the Second Great Awakening, he complained about the halfway covenant, and that Puritans were looking for outward conformity to a certain standard that they had set for the culture. And as long as that outward conformity was there, well, you can be part of the church. You're good to go. And Edwards said, no, religion is of the heart. You can't just allow a child to come to church and say he's okay on account of his parents. You can't, this is going to completely destroy our culture. And of course, we had the Second Great Awakening, but even Edwards says towards the end of his life, he talks about the Second Great Awakening waning. And that was kind of a temporary reprieve. And so, New England Christianity was already doomed, I think. I hesitate to put a year on it, but I want to say almost from its inception, it was there was a fundamental flaw, and it was that city on a hill idea. We are going to create the perfect, as near as we can perfect culture here on earth, and you just can't do it. You can't create a perfect society. And, if we just banish all our Ann Hutchinsons and our Roger Williams and anyone who doesn't conform with the standard, then we'll be okay. And that's not true. And I'm not saying you shouldn't have rules. I'm not saying the Word of God does not speak to, I do believe that absolutely the Word of God is very clear on the things that the government's responsibility is. But you had this kind of church and state in bed together and trying to perfect society, and it was too far. And the Southerners never really had that. And they were also, like you said, they were Presbyterians, a lot of them, but Anglicans as well, or Episcopalians rather. It's an American incarnation of Anglicanism. And they did not have that perfectibility. And it was the attitude that destroyed the Puritans. And the Southerners were, they were also Calvinists. They had the same basic theology on some things, but they did not have that emphasis upon this introspective emphasis upon upon themselves. They weren't looking in the mirror all the time to make sure that they were keeping the laws. And there's actually an essay, I'm trying to remember it. Richard Weaver, I believe, did this years ago, but it was, and I wish I could remember the title, but he compares essentially a Southerner and a New Englander. And it's a New England Puritan, and it's I forget who it was. I want to say the name William Cooper is jumping out to me for some reason, but this is kind of on the basis of what of his comparison is he says, look, these New Englanders are so introspective. They're always looking at themselves. They can never have fun because they're always the wrath of God is about to fall on them at any moment because they didn't do well, and they're always striving to do better, and they're never quite getting there. And look how stressful this is. And look at this, the Southerners, and how they're living more carefree. They're kind of just going with the flow of nature. And, when they do something wrong, they just apologize for it and they just receive the grace that's there. And it was a fascinating comparison. And I think he's right in that Southerners were more laid back. It was more easy for them to accept grace. And for the Northerners, it's that they constantly have to be on the move, constantly have to be doing something to make their lives meaningful, because their lives won't be meaningful unless they accomplish some great thing for the Lord. And we see that to our own day. There's always this strive. I can't even keep up with the political causes. After one political cause is kind of fizzling out, it's the next one, and it's always trying to strive to do something to make society better. Now, of course, it's along secular humanistic lines. It's not over a Christian understanding of what makes culture better, but that same attitude prevails. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there was a rebellion against the theology of New England, but not against the attitude. The attitude carries through, and the Yankees rejected the theology of their parents and grandparents, and they blamed the theology of them for a lot of their problems, but they never really fundamentally changed the attitude that they had. And so it just became applying the same attitude to a new set of morals. And that's where you get Unitarians, and then from them, liberals, and the mess we're dealing with today. And one of the greatest analogies I think I ever heard on this was, I believe it was Dr. Kerry Roberts, but he said that the South is more like a farm and the North is more like a stagecoach, where, the South, in the North conception, each horse is going in a particular direction. It's kind of like manifest destiny, and the South occupies one of the places on the stagecoach. They're one of the horses. So, you belong, you're part of this, but we are going in a direction. And if we don't go fast enough, the whip is going to crack, and we're going to get there. And there's hope for the future as long as we're moving. And it's moving towards perfection, which today is, of course, it's an egalitarian, emancipating yourself from every constraint of nature and morality. In the South, it's a farm. It's just, life is never going to be perfect. Right. We already accept that. It gets messy on the farm. The pig's going to be in the slop, and the chickens are, they're going to be making a mess. But that's life on the farm. Kind of get used to it and learn. It's like Charlotte's Web. Learn to be happy with it. Learn to smell the roses, consider the simple joys, and don't get worked up about the fact that there's mud in the pigsty. That's just the way it is. And I think that's a great analogy. And that certainly describes, I think, the way even religion was between the two. There was, like I said, the Southerners were accepting of grace, I think, a little more than the Northerners. So, yeah, I think you make a great point there.
If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. Was there anything else, maybe something that you had written that I haven't asked you about, but something particularly in the book that you would like for our listeners to understand?
I'm giving you the gist of the meaning of the book and its modern application. Obviously, for the citations and the particular quotes proving what I'm saying, go to the book, and I think that's what makes the book worth it. Is you can actually read the story and the words of the people that were involved in it. I think the moral that I want people to draw, I say this in the conclusion at the end, but there's a quote from Thornwell, and he says, and James Henley Thornwell, in case I keep mentioning him, but Southern Presbyterian preacher, but he said, "It is when we are prone to feel ourselves at home in this world, when things go smoothly, that the Lord finds it necessary to cross us and disappoint us, in order that we may know that this is not our rest." I think, to me, that quote has stuck with me when I was doing research for this. And the reason is because we should never feel at home in this world. There should be some kind of, we have joy, obviously, as Christians, we do, with the forgiveness that Christ gives us. But there should be something lacking a little bit because we're not where we're supposed to be yet. We're not truly home. And I think the problem with the northeastern strain of religion that infects us to this day is the idea that we can be at home in this world somehow if we just do the right things. And that creates a very stressful life for those who are trying to attain God's grace and find this perfection. And my message to myself, I'm preaching to myself here, is to kind of take a deep breath and realize that you're never going to get to that point of perfection. Perfectionism is just that's not the gospel. That's not I mean, it's the gospel only in the sense that it's when glorification happens, it's after death. So I think that's the main thing that I would want people to draw personally from the study. If there's anything politically, you need to
Right.
you need to get your facts straight on who the Confederates were, who the reason for their secession. I think this helps give Christians a good understanding of it. If you really read it and you do your research, and even if you're skeptical about some of the things I say, if you go and you look at the original quotations and so forth, you're not going to be for taking down monuments anymore. You're going to realize what this was about. So if there's any political implication, that would be it. Don't assume what you hear in the media, what you hear at school about this war is necessarily accurate. Go do your own homework, and hopefully this helps you do some of that. It points you in some of the right directions for Christians, specifically. So yeah, those two things I think are important to me. And if folks who read it have those two takeaways, then I would be perfectly happy.
So were you writing as part of a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation, or was this just a completely different work?
No, it was different. I was doing a paper in a theology. It was a historical theology course. I kind of got out of control with the paper. I was finding things that I thought were fascinating that I didn't know, and I just kept spending time on it. And it was supposed to be, I think, a 10-page or 15-page paper or something with 20 citations or so forth, and I ended up coming out with this thing at the end that it was double space Turabian style, and it was like 80 pages and over 100 citations. And my poor professor, I don't even know if he read the whole thing, but yeah, I mean, since then I've fine-tuned it some. I've in the preface I wrote that recently to talk about kind of the things that are going on today in the SBC, especially that's kind of more my wheelhouse, but also just in the Reformed, quote unquote, Reformed world in general. And I think I wrote it at the time when I wrote this. This was probably 8 or 9 years ago when I actually did a lot of the research for this. But at the time, this was before the Confederate flag controversy, so I wasn't writing in reaction to anything. I was writing because it fascinated me and because I thought this was a valuable part of the research for the war between the states that just doesn't make it into the books. And as time went on, I saw the necessity for actually putting this in public because of the controversies that were arising. And so I did a little fine tuning of it, but the basic research was done about 8 years ago. And I thought my audience would be, at that time it was kind of like the young Reformed movement in evangelical Christianity. And I thought, with people enjoying John Piper, who was constantly quoting Jonathan Edwards, and this was when Mark Driscoll was bigger, and Francis Chan, and there was just a lot of these young Reformed guys popping up everywhere. And I thought, well, this is the Reformation. This is these are Reformed people in America, and the only one that ever gets talked about is Jonathan Edwards, it seems like. And it kind of is almost like, the Puritans, and then we jump to, John MacArthur.
Right.
What about all the in-between? What about, maybe we'll talk about the modernist controversy, maybe the Princeton theologians during that time, but, we're studying the Puritans and saying that's our Reformed theology. And I thought, wait a minute, there is another movement in this country that's just as significant as the Puritans, in fact more significant, because they actually survived. Their denominations actually did better, and we don't even talk about them. And they have a different way of looking at some things. And I'm not diminishing study of the Puritans, but I do think that Southern theologians, Presbyterian theologians in particular, like Robert Louis Dabney, like Thornwell, they need to be looked at as well. And they're not. They don't get really a fair treatment. So I thought, well, this will be interesting to folks in that young Reformed camp who haven't really studied this area. They'll love that. And I was maybe naive because I don't know that they will love that, but but hopefully there's some. Hopefully some folks that would consider themselves maybe to be Southern, would consider themselves to be Christian, maybe even Reformed Christian. Maybe they can find some use in this and find an identity that they didn't previously have, and some of their history might make more sense to them, and and maybe they'll even consider consider having a different view of the war itself. I know right now, a lot of the people that I'm describing, the more young reform crowd, I mean, they're going a more social justice direction. And that wasn't the case when I did the research for this, but it is now. And I think, maybe they need to take a breath and research their own history of the theology that they say that they're advocating, and they find it's actually the opposite of what they're currently advocating. So, hopefully it'll have that effect with some, and the Lord's in control, though. So
right.
It's a useful study for anyone, I think. So.
Well, it's funny because my grandfather and my great-grandfather were both Southern Baptist pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a big complaint in the Southern Baptist Convention today about all the fundamentalists.
Yeah.
And all the conservatives and the conservative resurgence and all of these conservative and fundamentalist, professors in the seminaries. And I'm thinking to myself, the people who are being criticized for being the hyper-conservative fundamentalists, my great-grandfather would have called liberals.
Yeah, I know. It's interesting.
So, do you think that maybe the reason why even some of these, young Reformed guys are going the social justice direction is because the liberalism in our seminaries has finally caught up to our ministerial students?
It's the reason that in New England, all the seminaries who started, the Ivy Leagues who started out, I think with the exception of one Ivy League school to train clergy, went liberal, was because they eventually rejected the authority of Scripture, and they were getting their information about the world from outside sources other than theology. I mean, theology was the chief of the sciences. It was the primary one. And that's not the case anymore. And I think that is what's plaguing these conservative denominations as well. Most of the time, it's almost a comic at this point, but most of these seminaries are splits off of splits off of splits. It just goes on. It's, seminary becomes liberal, so we grab all our conservative resources and we go and we start another seminary. And that process just keeps continuing. I think the Southern Baptist Convention had obviously the resurgence, so they were able to, so they say, take back some of these seminaries, and to an extent they're right in that. They took it back from modernism, but now we're falling into postmodernism. So we fell on the other side of the road. They're doing what's been done for a long time. There's a subtle shift in academia. Knowledge puffs up, and you get people coming in because you want to diversify your campus. It's typical that you don't want people just from your seminary to be the professors. You want people from other places to come. So, for instance, let's say you're a Southern Baptist seminary and you want a professor to come in and teach history to your undergraduate students. Maybe you have a Bible school there as well, and history is required. So you're trying to meet these academic requirements that are imposed on you by accrediting agencies. So we have to teach these classes. We have to teach them in this way. And then we get prestige by bringing in someone from Harvard. Oh, someone from Yale, someone from Oxford. These are the big schools, but even someone from University of Chicago or something. Somewhere that's not us, somewhere that's secular, somewhere that has prestige. We'll bring them in and they'll teach us. Well, pretty soon you're bringing in people that don't really share. They may say they share your doctrinal beliefs. But, to take the example of a history professor, since that's my area, you might bring in a history professor who is a Christian, and he very well may legitimately be a Christian, but perhaps he does not approach history from a Christian point of view. So he's been thoroughly inculcated from grammar school to the point of his PhD with a liberal understanding and not an anti-Christian understanding of history, and now he's trying to put the best Christian spin he can on it. Well, if you believe that all the Christian forebears of us, they were all racist, and Luther's responsible for the Holocaust, and all the things that get told to you when you're doing that research and you accept and it's taken for granted, well, that's going to affect your seminary now, because you've now brought in wolves, not even thinking that they're wolves, and pretty soon they're going to outnumber the sheep. And I think that's the problem, and I've seen this firsthand happen. It doesn't even take that long. You'll have professors who you don't think there's anything wrong with them until a political movement comes about, and that's the spark that ignites the flame. They all all of a sudden at once you realize, wow, half our faculty, they're for Black Lives Matter. Didn't know that. Or you get a guy in that you think is, good, but, he's the president of the seminary and he's going to exert pressure on those who don't toe the line. I've had a Southern Baptist seminary professor tell me within the last year that if he said what he really believed, and he's more of a conservative, but if he said what he really believed about political things, even if he posted it, on a Twitter account or something like that, he would lose his job. And that's sad. I'm talking about a prominent Southern Baptist seminary. There's a lot of arm twisting. There's a lot of threats. But yeah, it's the nature of academia. It's man's wisdom, the ivory tower mentality. You start to think you are something when you're not. And that's why the pews are pretty much Republican and tend to be more conservative, the people sitting in the pews that are funding these institutions. But the institutions themselves, it's kind of like in the Old Testament when the children of Israel, they wanted to have a king. They wanted to be like the nations around them. Well, these seminaries want to be like the academic institutions around them. So they start mimicking things, and a little compromise leads to a lot of compromise eventually.
Extra, read all about it. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net.
Extra, read all about it. Just my activism as a as a pro-Southerner,
right,
would be enough to get me knocked out of.
Sad. Sad that that's where we're at.
I wrote a series of articles. One of them appeared. It appeared in the North Carolina state paper. It appeared in the Florida state paper. It appeared in a couple of state papers. And then there were a few more states that put it in their online edition but wouldn't put it in their print edition. But basically what happened was Russell Moore basically personally called all of the editors of all of the Southern Baptist state papers.
Oh, gosh.
And said, Dr. Ed DeVries is going to start sending you stuff. Whatever you do, don't print it. And the reason why was because, well, I'll put it to you this way. And I had no idea that this was in the works. But I've taken several mission trips to Cuba. And I should have known something was up when they arranged for me to be in Cuba during the week of the convention.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, because you don't send anybody out that week. But again, it was the death fear that someone might actually speak intelligently to these things. Essentially what happened, conflict got hotter.
Mm-hmm.
I got louder. And I said, no, I'm not backing down. I'm not quieting down. Somebody has to be the voice in this.
Mm-hmm.
I said, if for no other reason, I said, the Bible commands me to honor my father. Why was Jesus called the Son of David? Obviously, your father isn't just your father, but your grandfather, your great-grandfather, your great-great-grandfather, your great-great-great-grandfather. I said, so I have a biblical obligation to honor my ancestors. I said, it's in God's top 10. It made the top 10 list when he put it in the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, good point.
I said, so I'm not going to be quiet about this stuff. I said, if anything, I'm going to get louder. I said, as long as somebody is listening to me, I'm going to keep preaching. And so finally, and this was like a 3-year, this was like the last 3 years of the 7 kind of thing. And so finally, what ended up happening, he said, we can go to the convention. And this was 2017. The convention was in November, the state convention was in September of 2019. I mean, in November of 2017. He said, there's 2 ways we could do this. He said, and this was like around September, we had this conversation. He said, there's 2 ways we can do this. He said, we can go to the convention. He said, and we can ask the messengers to fire you.
Mm-hmm.
He said, and they may do it and they may not. He said, I really don't know how that's going to play. He said, but chances are, chances are, he said, pretty much we can manipulate the messengers. He said, if you don't want the embarrassment of that, he said, then basically what you're looking at, he said, this is what we want to do. He said, we just want to eliminate your position from the budget. He said, and what that essentially will mean is that, next year when the new budget goes into effect, you just won't have a job anymore. He said, basically, 3,000 messengers will fire you, but they won't even know that they did it. He said, because nobody reads the budget before they approve it. He said, it's a voice vote, and he said, they'll approve the budget, and when they do, your job is gone. He said, and it'll be whatever. And even with that, I mean, I still had a option, because I could have gone to the convention, and I could have spoke from the floor, and I could have called to the messenger's attention that, they were eliminating my job from the budget and why I wanted it to be kept in there, or,
right.
whatever. But I just chose to take my wife on a cruise that week. I just skipped the state convention that year. So when the messengers were eliminating my job, when the messengers were passing the budget that eliminated my job, I was on a beach in Mexico with my wife.
Oh, nice.
I just started making some phone calls, found myself some other stuff to do, as far as writing and some things to make up for that income.
I'm glad you're able to find that. I'd be curious if you have anything, because the Lottie Moon thing, I didn't want to, obviously it wasn't the focus of our conversation, but I remember, I think it was Donnie Kennedy had, you wrote The South Was Right. He had on his Facebook page last Christmas had brought up, is there any way that we can confirm that the Lottie Moon who was the spy is the same Lottie Moon? And I remember, I just did some Googling. I didn't really do a lot of research at all, but it seemed to me that there were two Lottie Moons, and one was a Confederate spy and one was a missionary. But it seems like you know more than I do. So was Lottie Moon the missionary also a spy, or do you have any information on that? I'm just curious.
Well, I'll send you the links to the Southern Baptist for Southern Heritage videos that I did. Okay. I'm of the opinion that they were the same person, and that the two Lottie Moon is a historical fabrication to shield certain people from the fact of history that they don't want to own up to.
Okay.
Now, that said, I've not dug deep enough into this probably I could potentially be proven wrong at some point. Oh, but one of the things that I did in these videos is, I actually had some cell phone footage that somebody had taken when they were passing the resolution condemning the Confederate flag and so forth. If you look at the video, most of the messengers did not vote. And the reason why, do you know who Judge Pressler is?
I've heard that name, yes.
Okay, he was a federal judge who was appointed by, of all people, Bill Clinton.
Yes.
So, the guy's a Democrat. You would think the guy would be a liberal, and he probably is politically, but he's also kind of the mastermind of the conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptist Convention. And so Jimmy Merritt and these guys who were up on the platform literally owe their positions in the convention to this guy. And they had him drug out of the back of the convention hall by security because he's pointing out that the whole process of taking the vote and passing the resolution was out of order.
Oh, gosh. Because
there was a pastor from Louisiana who, during discussion, had basically put a motion on the floor to table the whole thing. And Judge Pressler's like, we can't vote to pass a resolution until we first vote whether or not we're going to table the proposal.
Right.
And the parliamentarian, who I can't remember his name now, but he's a Presbyterian guy. They hired some Presbyterian guy to come and be the parliamentarian for the Southern Baptist Convention. And so after this whole thing is finally done, he gives this long explanation about how it was parliamentarily correct or whatever. But all the messengers knew the thing was out of order, and I would say the majority of them didn't even want to go there to begin with. And so nobody's voting. You're like looking at this full convention hall, and the cameras, this guy's panning his phone, and people aren't voting. And yet Jimmy Merritt's like talking about how it's this unanimous, overwhelming. It wasn't. And so I actually take the video footage with, obviously with some commentary and interruption by myself throughout it. And so that's the rather long video, but yeah, one of them is the Lottie Moon video.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. I was like, how many people are named Lottie Moon? It's like, okay, I mean.
I did one on General Julius Howell. Did one on let's see. It's number 4 is the Lottie Moon video.
Okay.
The last one I did, number 6, was just kind of it was just Rush Limbaugh talks about fighting absurdity by being absurd, and so it's why we should boycott Coca-Cola because it's a Southern product.
Oh, sure.
And it was created by a Confederate.
Right, I've heard that.
And so we're all going to have to drink Pepsi. Oh, but wait a minute. Pepsi was started in North Carolina by a Confederate. So, And then it's like, we just need to boycott all soft drinks because,
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah, so the North Carolina Heritage Political Action Committee was organized by concerned citizens of North Carolina in 2015 in response to the increased attacks on North Carolina's history and heritage. The North Carolina Heritage PAC supports state and local candidates for public office who pledge and show their support for the protection of Confederate memorials and the preservation of all of North Carolina's history. We all know that Confederate memorials and symbols are the easy targets, and that the end game of our leftist enemies is to erase and rewrite all of history, from the colonies to the War on Terror. If we fight them for our state's rich Confederate history and heritage, we may be able to stop them from their mission of total destruction. Join the North Carolina Heritage PAC now by visiting ncheritagepac.org. Once again, that is www.ncheritagepac.org. And help us on the front lines of North Carolina politics. The mission statement of North Carolina Heritage PAC is that the North Carolina Heritage PAC was created with the purpose of supporting diverse efforts to defend and preserve the heritage, traditions, monuments, cemeteries, flags, emblems, and other legacies of North Carolina history against those efforts to remove, deface, legislate against, alter, and otherwise corrupt or pervert their meaning, history, presentation, and standing in our state. Once again, www.ncheritagepac.org. Okay, when something is so historically accurate that we will throw you in jail for questioning it.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like, if it's that whatever that we can't write about this, that we can't even ask these questions.
Right.
It's like they just got it in their head. That just means we're going to ask.
I know it's used for political purposes for sure. And it's used to try to knock down any kind of nationalism there could ever be because, well, look what nationalism leads to. It's this. And I know that's not correct. It wasn't nationalism that was the problem. And if that's kind of the gripe people have, I get that. I understand that. That's not freedom, I guess. But still, I have to take it into account, I guess, somewhat.
I just came to the conclusion, what did Solomon say? He said, the fear of man bringeth a snare.
Oh, sure, yeah.
At some point, it was like I just had to come to the conclusion that I was either going to just back down or, be the bull in the china cabinet, because those are really your only two options. There is no middle.
Yeah.
There is no middle to this thing. And because one sure discovered the other side will never let you rest. And so, I just decided that, I'm just going to preach it. And, God promised that, what did David say? I've never seen the righteous forsaken nor his seed begging bread.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'd be curious to read some of that stuff at some point. I can't now because of my studies, but maybe during the break, I can check out some of that stuff. I've asked my professors about some of these things. He's pretty, dismissive of it, but because I have another friend he's told me the numbers are inflated and so forth as well. So it's just not the conventional. So, yeah.
Well, I interviewed a dear friend of mine, and he's a pastor in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And he agreed to let me interview him on the radio show on the condition that I not use his name.
Oh, okay.
And he's actually he's a pastor in Germany. He pastors a Baptist church in Germany, and he's also an executive for one of their state-run insurance agencies.
Mm-hmm.
How I met him was in high school. He was an exchange student.
Mm-hmm.
And it was his senior year of high school. And he had actually graduated from high school in Germany the year before, because they only do 3 years of high school in Germany.
Okay.
But for whatever reason, he decided that he wanted to come to the United States and do whatever. So he came to the United States as an exchange student. So he wound up graduating in Germany, then graduating here because he was essentially a senior. And he got saved. And so he ended up staying here in the country and going to Bible college and going to seminary. And then he went back to Germany. The last time I saw him was about 2 years ago. The German army has some kind of an arrangement with the United States military. And this goes back to World War II. And, for a number of years, the Germans weren't even allowed to have their own military. essentially the way it works is that essentially the members of the German military before the European Union were actually part of the U.S. military, and even now that they're technically part of the EU, whatever, they've still got this agreement through NATO or whatever, where if they have certain skills, somehow or another, he's at Fort Lejeune, he's in the Marine Corps now. He ended up transferring from the German Army to the Marine Corps because he had some kind of a skill. Somehow or another, he in the repair of whatever type of radios that they use in these tanks, that's his specialty. Anyways, so Brother Rudiger and his wife had come to visit their son there at Fort Lejeune, and they shot down to Florida for a couple days, and we went to Disney, went out to dinner or whatever. But anyways, he agreed to let me interview him and everything and put it on the radio there, as long as I didn't use his name, because he didn't want any blowback there in Germany. And I asked him point blank, and and it's funny because he'll admit all kinds of things to me when we're talking in this country. Like if we're on the phone or something, he won't, for fear that even their telephone conversations are being listened to by their government. I just flat asked him. I said, did you have ancestors that were Nazis? I get criticized for my Confederate ancestors. Did you have ancestors who were Nazis? He's like, well, yeah, of course I did. We all do.
Right.
And I said, were they evil? He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, obviously, the Nazis, committed the Holocaust.
Right.
I said, so do you believe that your grandfather and your uncles and all that? I said, do you believe that they were evil men because they fought for this evil army, for this evil government that perpetrated the Holocaust? He's like, well, no. He's like real hesitant. I'm like, so did you know your grandfather? I'm like, yes. And you grew up with your grandfather? Yes. I'm like, so what did you do with your grandfather? Well, we went fishing, whatever.
Yeah. I'm
like, did he ever tell you stories about the war? He's like, well, yeah. I'm like, were they the same stories that you learned in school? He goes, no. Yeah. I'm like, well, who do you believe, your grandfather or the school teacher? He's like, well, I don't know. I'm like, well, was your grandfather a liar? Is there a reason you don't believe him? And he's like, well, no, I believe him. I don't believe he was a liar. I said, so then he was an honest man with integrity, and you loved him. And he goes, well, yeah. I go, so he wasn't an evil Jew murderer. He's like, well, no. No. I'm like, so what did he do? He's like, well, I think he drove a truck. I'm like, gosh. Yeah. And I'm like, well, I said, and I asked him, I said, let me just bring this to where I want to bring it to, for the sake of our conversation. I said, in my country, I'm being told, and most of the listeners to my radio show are being told, that we need to condemn our ancestors.
Right.
And we need to condemn our entire culture and our entire society and our entire civilization and our entire history and our entire everything, because somebody 150 years ago owned slaves.
Right.
I said, so slavery just is the tarnish on everything. I said, so should I take the last 50 years of Germany, and should I take all of your ancestors and all of your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles and just castigate them to hell? He's like, well, no. I'm like, but isn't that what your government's asking you to do? And he's like, well, I guess this is why I asked you not to use my name in the interview, but yes.
Sure.
But, it's more extreme over there.
Right.
But it's just a matter of time before the same thing happens over here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I would not doubt it at all. It'll take a different form for sure, but it's already happening. Look, blacklisted, and I had major problems during where I went to school just from personal views that I put on a blog. And I had the vice president of the school reach out to me and basically threaten me. And, it's incredible to me what's happened in the Southern Baptist Convention. And, it's not a far stretch to say that the next step would be kind of what they're doing over there, making it illegal to say certain things. I sure hope it doesn't come to that, but you might be right.
Literally, it is a crime for him to put to put flowers on his grandfather's grave.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. That's what it's become over there. You can't do anything that glorifies the Third Reich. It's like they've identified all the people who were in the Third Reich.
Right.
And so, yeah, they can't do anything to glorify the Third Reich. They can't do anything to glorify any member of the Third Reich or whatever, yeah. So, and I'm not saying that he would be convicted of that crime, but in a technical sense, it is a crime for the man to put flowers on his grandfather's grave. Yeah, so it's crazy, but yeah, it's like you can't even have the discussion anymore. But what was it? Thursday, the Secretary of the Interior made the comment. He was at a dedication. I want to say in Ohio.
Yeah.
He was dedicating something at a military base in Ohio, and at that particular military base, where that base was actually established, was during the war because it was because they were keeping Confederate prisoners there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess there was a certain area of the military base that they've sectioned off, and it's going to be a historical, whatever. And the Secretary of the Interior was doing the dedication.
Mm-hmm.
And the Secretary of the Interior basically made the statement to the effect that there are certain people in this country that just need to get over themselves. He said, and they need to realize that neither the right or the left, or neither the north or the south, or whatever, neither the blacks or the whites, however you want to divide this. It's like nobody has a monopoly on the heroes. He's like, Robert E. Lee was a hero, and
that's good.
Yeah, he goes, Robert E. Lee was a national hero, and Martin Luther King was a national hero. He said for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
He said they were both men of their times.
Right.
And they both contributed tremendously to the development of this nation.
Absolutely.
And he said, and by honoring Robert E. Lee, you do not dishonor Martin Luther King, just as honoring Martin Luther King never dishonored Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, very good point.
He's like, and people today just need to be mature enough to get that. He said the country always understood that. Just like he said, if you look in Washington. He said, if you look at Washington, D.C., He said, in the Lincoln Memorial, Lincoln's back is to Jefferson. He said, and it's not because Lincoln turned his back on Jefferson. He goes, it's because the nation is ever moving forward. He goes, and if you look at it, he goes, the Martin Luther King Monument in D.C., his back is to Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. For
the same reason, the country's moving forward.
Yeah,
and
very true.
Yeah. But but he's probably going to be. Well, let's just say that the entire left is calling for the Secretary of the Interior to be removed from. Yeah.
And praise God, he's there. I'm glad he is.
And Pelosi's already said if she becomes Speaker, he's gone. That the House can impeach him, and that they will.
I used to listen to. Years ago, there was this Dixie broadcasting thing out of Georgia with Ray McBarry. And I don't know what happened to that. And then, of course, the Abbeville podcast now. I listen to that sometimes. But, I hadn't heard of yours. So I'm glad that there's more out there, like yourself. Well, I remember do you know who Paul Washer is? You ever heard that name?
Yes, sir. But I'm trying to remember. I've heard the name, but I'm trying to remember who he was.
He did the shocking youth message, kind of a fire and brimstone preacher out of Radford, Virginia. He runs a missions organization called Heart Cry. He's kind of we were talking about the young restless reform thing. But he was kind of one of the guys, very humble guy, but and he wasn't even a pastor. He just ran a missions organization. But because of his kind of fire and brimstone like preaching, and he was kind of a popular guy. There's a picture of him in a Confederate reenacting uniform firing a gun. And my brother had gone to a conference, a Christian reform conference of some kind, and there was a picture of him there in this Confederate uniform, and they were trying to sell, I think it was, I don't remember what it was they were selling, but they had, for whatever reason, Paul Washer's picture there. Maybe they were selling uniforms, I don't even know why, but here's Paul Washer in a Confederate uniform. And the guy at the front desk told my brother, he said, you better not dare take a picture of that picture, because, Brother Paul warned me that, this basically, you can use it to advertise, but don't ever let it get on the internet or you're going to be getting a call from me. I just thought, I was like, wow, that's interesting. But it was encouraging to me a little bit when I heard that. I was like, okay, not everyone is buying into this liberal garbage, but everyone is afraid of it. So you're not hearing the pushback, but it's not that it's not there. Some people have it and they're proud of their ancestors, but it's just not seeing the light of day because of intimidation. So I just thought if you had heard of him, perhaps you would have found some encouragement in that. But
I don't know that it would be the same now.
And maybe not.
But I grew up in Hammond, Indiana. Jack Hiles made no bones about the fact that he was from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes he would joke about his age, and he'd been a paratrooper during World War II. But sometimes he would joke about his age, and he would talk about his military whatever. He said, and when I was in the Army fighting for the South during the Civil War.
Yeah.
Or like on Memorial Day or Veterans Day or whatever, 4th of July, different days. He would tell the organist Miss Colston, he'd say, Miss Colston, play the national anthem, and she played Dixie. This is in a church with 26,000 people in the auditorium.
That's hysterical.
Yeah, and I don't know that. And he might be of the temperament that, if this stuff were going on during his lifetime, he probably would be like me and, get louder rather than quieter.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people probably, have got, that used to be very,
sure,
very in tune with their heritage. In fact, I asked Dr. Merritt that question. I said, Dr. Merritt, I know you have Confederate ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I know.
Mm-hmm.
I said, have they become any less honorable? He goes, no. He goes, but this is the direction. He said, you either go with it or you get, left behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's like, this is the direction we're going, whether we like it or not. And so he just decided to get in rather than, he's like, he said, I decided to ride in the train rather than being the guy like you who's chasing behind it, screaming at it. So how does someone get a copy of your book?
Yeah, you can go to Amazon. If you type in Sacred Conviction in the search bar, it'll come right up. It's there's an ebook of it, so you can get it on a Kindle, or you can get a hard copy. I think the $5, I think, for the Kindle version and there's $10 for the hard copy. And or you could go to Shotwell Publishing, and they'll link you, I think, to Amazon if you go there, if I'm not mistaken. So either way, Shotwell Publishing, which is shotwellpublishing.com, or just go to amazon.com and type in Sacred Conviction, and it'll come right up.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, I would like to thank you for being our guest today.
Well, you're quite welcome.
And
yeah, thank you for doing what you do, and I appreciate the interview and all. And Lord willing, we'll stay connected, and anything that comes up, if I can be of help, I guess let me know. You have my email.
And with that, we are out of time, and so this is going to conclude this week's broadcast of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. There, toward the end of our conversation, of course, we were talking about some political things that were kind of current at the time of the discussion. That was a couple of weeks ago when this was recorded. But you're wondering how they turned out. The Secretary of the Interior, as far as I know, is still the Secretary of the Interior. There have been some other things that have kind of become hotter politically. Not to say that the liberals in Congress will not revisit the Secretary of the Interior later when they finally get past this whole wall controversy. Professor J being our guest again and giving us a second hour so that we can finish discussing his great book, Sacred Conviction. I hope that you'll go to the Shotwell Publishing website and check it out. It's a great read, and it'll really put a lot of things into perspective for you. You will be glad that you took the time to study it. I'd also like to encourage you to go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, and when you do, I'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. I would also like to sign you up to receive the Dixie Heritage Letter absolutely free each and every week. There's no cost and no obligation for these publications. We're just happy to put them in your hands every week, to put the information in your hands. And there's not a charge for these things. So don't feel like, well, I'll go to the website and then they'll hit me up for my credit card, or they'll do this or they'll do that, or or I'll sign up for something for free and then they'll hit me with a subscription charge. We don't do anything like that. You don't even give us a credit card number. All you do is literally give us an email address, and we send you the ebook and we send you the newsletter every week by email, and there's no charge for either one. So with that said, tune in again, same place, same time next week. We'll have another great broadcast for you. Until then, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie